If you're a fan of side-scrolling pixel art action-adventure titles, then Gunbrella is going to be right up your alley. The titular Gunbrella is not only your primary weapon, but it's also your primary means of traversal. It also serves as a primary plot device as well, and this is a fairly short game. Your first playthrough will probably run you 4 to 6 hours, depending on the difficulty, but there are decision paths that can affect the ending, so there is replayability here. Before we start, I want to make this clear, this is not a Metroidvania. So if you were looking at the pixel art style and saying to yourself that this is going to be a Metroidvania, there's going to be all these hidden secrets and new abilities, all that stuff, no, that's not what Gunbrella is. It is an action-adventure title. There is solid combat, and then there's also some pretty solid platforming. Beyond that though, what you start with in this game is essentially all you're going to have. There are side quests in this game that you can take part in. They're going to grant you all sorts of goodies like heart containers, resources for upgrading your weapon, money, that sort of stuff. But there is nothing that will upgrade your character in terms of new abilities. So if you're expecting like a double jump and all that stuff, not going to happen. Basically, your Gunbrella is your primary means of traversal in this game. With that out of the way, let's talk about the game. So in terms of narrative, pretty solid. It's a tale of revenge, and it gets increasingly dark as you make your way through the game. There are some seriously brutal moments, but luckily it's not devoid of humor. This is not necessarily what you describe as a self-serious game. There are a number of really funny moments. There's a lot of dark humor in it. Some that kind of took me by surprise. There's one scene in particular where I was expecting this major fight. I was prepping myself, and it was met by this really hilarious, brutal end. I had to put the controller down for a moment, and I just started laughing because the buildup in this section, you're going around, find these different enemies, it's quick traversal, and then I was thinking to myself, there's going to be this crazy major confrontation at the end, and then I was literally caught off guard by what had happened. Like, I just couldn't stop laughing. I just thought that was great. I really enjoyed the black humor in this game. There is some surprising depth in Gunbrella. I didn't expect certain characters to have meaningful side stories, and a lot of these games, because there's no voice acting, and when you're moving from different areas, you'll see certain characters, they'll have some quips of dialogue, and then they just move on. That's really not how it is in this game. You can actually talk to a lot of characters and get a lot of backstory and lore, not only about the events that are happening, but about them as well. And I found myself being surprised by that because there are characters who you're going to meet at the beginning of the game who are going to undergo some really surprising transformations. It was something really unexpected but very appreciated. It actually adds weight to the narrative and also to the overarching themes of the world. And it does show that your character is making an impact in this world. I thought that was awesome. Something that, that shouldn't have been expected in one of these titles. You're expecting just a straightforward action-adventure game, but instead, you're getting some nice depth. When it comes to the gameplay, for the most part, I think it's really good. It's broken down to two categories, which are platforming and combat. And here's the deal. The Gunbrella is pretty much at the center of all of it. You're going to find out pretty quickly that the Gunbrella is a very versatile weapon. You can use it to stun enemies by dashing into them, block incoming attacks. If you time your block, you can parry, and this can do significant damage if you're deflecting projectiles back at enemies. I found myself using the parry often because when you parry projectiles, it does far more damage than when you are just normally attacking, which was kind of weird to me, but I loved it. The one thing that I think will take you by surprise with the Gunbrella is just how much different ammunition there is for it. I was not expecting for there to be this much in terms of variety, but you do get a lot. When I first played the demo, I thought you get a machine gun, get a grenade launcher, you might get a flamethrower, you might get like a hook shot or something, but that's pretty much it. By the end of the game, you have so many different types that I wasn't even using all of them. So don't worry, you are fully equipped to handle every enemy this game has to offer. And enemies in this game range from being idle and easy to handle by themselves to incredibly aggressive and very fast. It's really surprising sometimes when I was playing through this game that you can take on enemies one by one and really not have too much of a challenge But if you happen to just want to dash through certain areas because you want to really get good with traversal and maybe you're speedrunning the game, if you happen to mess up on one of your dashes, you get caught, you're going to notice that a lot of these enemies are going to be right behind you and they are very aggressive. You're going to want to make sure that when you're in combat, you are not stationary because you will die. I found myself getting killed a few times because I was not expecting the enemy to blitz me at the speed that they did. Seriously, I was shocked at times with how fast some of these enemies were. And you do have limited health early on, so it's recommended that you make sure to collect items after a kill because there will be drops for items that can temporarily extend your health. Make sure you extend your health before boss fights and keep bandages on you constantly because regardless of how much health you have, it will always bring you back to full health. So it's not one of those things where if you have a health kit or whatever it is in other games, it only gives you so much amount of health. If you have a bandage, it's automatic full health all the time and is a lifesaver, especially in some of the more difficult boss fights. Speaking of bosses, there are a number of them in this game. And I just want to say that there are some that are really challenging, but I also want to highlight that the quality of the bosses in Gunbrella are all over the place. There are those that are going to provide you a real challenge. Like seriously, they're going to have multiple phases, different attack patterns. You're going to really enjoy these types of fights because they're super engaging. They're very fast. They have these crazy move sets that are going to surprise you and you can deflect. Don't forget that you can block and parry and you can move some of these bosses around. Those were the best fights in the game. I really felt like some of the earlier fights were really challenging because you were learning the mechanics of Gunbrella. But when you start to get near the end of the game, for whatever reason, I felt like the quality would dip a bit. And you would get bosses that had really basic attack patterns, and you would have bosses in which the second phase of them was like them being stationary, shooting a weapon at you so that you could deflect and do maximum damage. It was really strange to me that early on you had some bosses that were just like these really big to scale, fast, had a number of crazy moves. And then you got to some bosses where you're like, they only do 2 attacks, so I can kind of just tank hits and just shoot because you do have iframes. So I was just kind of sitting there shooting at the enemy, doing a bunch of damage, then killing them. And I was like, okay, well, that was kind of strange. I really didn't know what to expect in terms of the boss fights here because in the demo, the first boss you fight is called the Baby. And that boss fight has a number of different patterns, but the moment you start to understand what's happening, you can just kind of stay stationary in the second phase and you won't get almost any damage done to you. But there are bosses where if you stay stationary, they will absolutely abuse you. So the quality of those bosses, like I said, it's all over the place. It's probably going to frustrate some people, but that was like the only problem I had with the actual enemies in this game. I found it really strange that you had some enemies that were really challenging, some were just really idle, but the boss fights I felt like should have been like the things that were really challenging you all the time, and they just don't. It's a really strange design for me because I expected that after that first boss fight, I was going to get more like them, and that was just not the case. I'm sorry about that rant. I just had to get that off my chest. If you happen to play this game, you happen to go through some of the boss fights, let me know how you feel about it because I have opinions and I do want to share them. So let's move on to platforming. I think it's really good. Now I want to make this clear. There are no difficult platforming sections to speak of. If you're expecting Celeste or any other title like that, you're not going to find that here. So keep that in mind. While the platforming sections do have their challenges, there is nothing that's going to make you want to break your controller. This is a far easier platformer than any of those games. Serious. Do not go in thinking this is Celeste. Now, because the Gunbrella is the focal point of the gameplay, that means it's your primary means of traversal. You can dash in multiple directions, and if you happen to dash upwards, you're going to get some nice lift, but remember that unless you hit a surface, you cannot dash again. Chaining wall jumps can be pretty satisfying, but you need to be precise, otherwise you're going to miss the platform you are trying to land on. When you are using the Gunbrella to dash, you get a nice bit of float to it. So you're going to go probably overshooting a number of things early on. Just keep that in mind. I expected some challenging platforming sections. Like you, when I see these types of games, I think there's going to be some hardcore break your controller type moments. And honestly, there's not, because the only challenging platforming sections are the ones where there are enemies in the area. And if you do not upgrade your gun damage through the game, you're more than likely going to end up getting killed and pretty frustrated in those sections. So, to remedy those issues, make sure you upgrade your weapon damage so that you can get through some of these platforming sections fairly easily. I also think that Gunbrella has a fairly forgiving checkpoint system if you die, but there are moments in which if you fail a long platforming section, you will not die, but it's going to take you back to the beginning of that section, so that can be pretty frustrating. You will lose like 1 health bar, but beyond that, you're not dead, so you will have multiple chances. Regardless of whether you're engaging in combat or platforming, Gunbrella just feels good to play. I think that if the controls were not tight or responsive, I would have a hard time recommending this game. This game is at its best when it's in motion. And when they give you these sections in which they lock you in, they say you have to kill all these enemies. So what you have to do is pretty much navigate the environment, and sometimes there's going to be hazards here and there. But for the most part, you're navigating that environment, you're zipping around killing enemies. And I just feel like when you're in motion and you hit that flow state, Gunbrella feels amazing. The unfortunate part is those sections, in my opinion, are kind of few and far between. There's not that many really big set piece moments where you can absolutely see the potential of Gunbrella, because sometimes it's just straight up one-on-one fights where you can just kind of pick enemies off. But when you get locked in to a certain area, that's where I think this game really shines. Overall, I think Gunbrella is an easy recommendation. It is a title that really respects your time. The pace is fairly brisk. Like I said, 4 to 6 hours on your first playthrough, but that depends on the difficulty. Not much backtracking to speak of. It takes some surprising turns narratively. It has a unique pixel art style. I love the fact that the Gunbrella is not only your primary means for everything gameplay, but it's also a major plot device. I just think that's really unique. I just feel like Gunbrella does a lot of good things, and that I cannot think of anything that's a major flaw, something that would really detract someone from playing this game. It's $15. So if you want a really solid indie title in what has been a really solid year for indies, I think Gunbrella is going to be right up your alley. Just bear in mind, this is not a Metroidvania. It is not going to be a super tight platforming title like Celeste. If you go in wanting to play a unique pixel art style action adventure game, then Gunbrella is going to be for you, and it's just an easy recommendation for me. And that's going to do it for this video. So if you like the content, please consider like, sharing, subscribing. I'm Ken from Pixelated Thoughts. I'll talk to you next time.